Welcome back to Gray and Gritty. My name is LJ Winnefeld.
And my name is Sandy Winnefeld, coming to you from Dallas today.
Nice, Dad. How's Dallas? It's very snowy and cold and wet here in D.C.
It's actually nice out down here, nice and warm, pleasant, no problem. It's supposed to rain tomorrow, though, so, I got to get out of here.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'll tell you, you have ruined a phrase for me forever because you mentioned it on the podcast a couple times ago when I mentioned the phrase precision strikes. Because over the last 48, 72 hours, I have read headline after headline, news article after news article saying precision strikes. And in the back of my head is you saying, well, if it's a strike, isn't it already precise?
Well, I think the word I really object to is targeted strikes. Precision or non-precision, whatever, but targeted strikes implies that there are things like non-targeted strikes, which, that's kind of a non sequitur. So, yeah.
Yeah, we talked about,
targeted
like Russians fill in a grid square with artillery,
well,
maybe.
It's kind of like AIML, runs off the tongue, but artificial intelligence, machine learning, ML, is a subset of artificial intelligence. There are other types of artificial intelligence, but it's kind of like secret no foreign, rolls off the tongue.
Yep, secret no foreign. Yeah, well, I guess there's the five eyes there. But anyway, I want to jump straight into the topic today. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to bang through this really fast because there's so much information about the Iranian U.S. conflict that has come up. We're not going to cover everything. If you want to read about the strikes, if you want to read about the latest target that's gotten hit, that's being covered by New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox News. You pick your different news outlet. But instead, I wanted to talk about some of the follow-on effects, some of the third and fourth order consequences with your dad, because I think that everyone gets sucked into, what is getting hit? Is the Strait of Hormuz going to close? What's the price of oil, right? And they think, talking about the price of oil is a secondary effect, right? But I think that there are so many other things. Everything in this world is interconnected, especially nowadays. And so I wanted to talk about some of that with you.
I think one of the most important things we probably should talk about, because it's on everybody's mind, is how does this end? And one of the things that's challenging right now is that there's so many different signals coming from the administration on why it started. There's regime change. There's there's an imminent threat from Iran, and then this sort of circular argument of, well, we think Israel was about to strike Iran, and Iran was going to retaliate against us, so we needed to preemptively strike Iran. It's like, wait a minute, doesn't that kind of like chasing your tail logic? So that's one of the things that's complicating how this thing's end. And one of the most important things about it is that when the president says, I want regime change, people of Iran rise up and overthrow your leaders, that makes those leaders in not just sort of business as usual conflict, it's existential for them, and they're not going to quit. They will not give up as long as it's existential for them. So I think one of the key components of this thing ending, however it ends, is the fact that the president has laid the predicate to blame a failure to do regime change on the Iranian people. He's very clearly said, hey, in January I said a few things that it was unacceptable that you guys were being slaughtered, and now I have gone in and I've killed the Ayatollah and a bunch of his leaders. I've laid the conditions for you all to rise up, take over your government. And if they don't do it, he can go, hey, look, I did everything that I could do, short of putting boots on the ground. The Iranian people didn't have the courage to stand up and do this, so I wash my hands of it. So that's how he handles if there's a failure to actually do successful regime change. And then the rest of it could be potentially maybe Qatar negotiates a nuclear deal that he was going to get anyway on Thursday if he'd wanted it. So there's probably a path forward, but I do believe that there are a lot more munitions that are going to be expended in the next couple of weeks before this thing comes to a close.
It's like the Pottery Barn rule no longer exists. You break it, you buy it. You break it, you've got to fix it. And that's the one thing that I've seen from the administration so far is, hey, we're not going to be here for a forever war, right? We're not going to get put boots on the ground. It's the onus is on the Iranian people or our allies or partners, which is a big change. And it's something where it's like, it's easy to dismiss. Hey, we did everything we could without putting boots on the ground. And the Iranian people just didn't rise up. But I think that even that could be seen as a failure potentially, because it's like, hey, maybe it was a big miscalculation. Now you've expended all this munitions. You've basically kicked the hornet's nest, and you didn't get the end desired result. But I think to put a bow on this thing, I think that anybody says this is how this is gonna end is lying and is wrong, because nobody can predict. I mean, wars, in general, particularly conflicts in the Middle East, are notoriously difficult to control and predict where they're going to end. And so if someone's saying this is going to end in a nuclear deal or this is going to end regime change, has no clue what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think you can talk about potential components of an ending, but to try to predict
Absolutely.
this is a fool's errand. And I honestly don't think that the administration necessarily cares what kind of government would emerge in Iran if the regime fell. And what they want is a government who's not going to be, a terrorist entity, who's not going to develop a nuclear weapon, who's not going to do all those things. And it's kind of hard. It's sort of hard to turn a society like Iran's into a Jeffersonian democracy. So you can't really blame them for that. They really would. They just want Iran to be on good behavior for a change, which
I'm seeing a lot of stuff
50 years it hasn't.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of stuff that's like regime 2.0 or 3.0.
Yeah,
I think Friedman had a piece in the New York Times saying a regime 2.0, where it's not much of a change, but maybe it's a much less aggressive regime that doesn't sponsor terrorism around the world. Awesome. Yep. Well, I think we spent enough time talking about the immediate consequences and what's happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. Let's shift to some of the third and fourth order effects. And really, the biggest thing that I want to touch on first with you, Dad, because we have talked about this before, is U.S. weapons stockpiles and the industrial base, reality that comes with expending all of these munitions. Does this put us at risk in other theaters, potential conflict with China? I guess, does this put us at risk writ large throughout the world? And then the second part of that question would be, do you think, and we can dive into China a little bit, do you think that this maybe is a signal for China to say, hey, they're not going to have the munitions necessarily to confront us if we wanted to make a lunge at Taiwan sooner than, we had otherwise planned?
Yeah, so one of the components of the decisions on use of force that we've talked about before on this podcast and we've written about is, this rank ordered national security interests and where the intersections are and where there's high correlation, that you would be more willing to act unilaterally, to do it at great cost of blood and treasure, and to do it pushing against international law, and also to do it at opportunity cost, meaning if I do this over here, I might not be able to do it over there. And that's not just a force structure argument where your force is tied up. It's also a munitions argument, as you point out. And we are using a tremendous amount of sophisticated weapons, air defense weapons, and offensive weapons in this conflict. And it goes without saying, the Defense Department recently has been putting a lot of pressure on the weapons manufacturers to speed up production, to produce more weapons faster. And it's a little bit ironic because for a decade, and I pushed against this when I was the vice chairman, the services favored force structure over buying weapons. And so the defense primes do what they're told. They don't do things out of the goodness of their heart. So they went down to minimum sustaining rate and in some cases quit making these munitions. And it's very, very hard to ramp these things back up because they're not only assembly lines and there are people who have to do this, there's also a very critical supply chain. And some of the components in these missiles are the same in between various missiles, so you have to make a choice. And rocket motors are a huge issue right now. So it's going to take some effort. The defense primes, I know for a fact, are working as hard as they can. It would be helpful if the Defense Department could get multi-year contracts for them so that they are incentivized to invest the capital required to really ramp up this production. But it's going to be an issue for a while. Now, one of the things people are saying is, we're going to run out of weapons in this conflict. Well, we may run out of some high-end, Patriots, THAADs, even AMRAAMs, that kind of thing. But we have an awful lot of what you would call dumb bombs to which you can apply a smart kit that turns it into a very smart bomb. And it's going to take a long time for us to run out of those. And as long as we have air supremacy, which I believe we have over Iran, we're going to be able to sustain this for a while. But your point is well taken. The only sort of semi-good news there is I think the whole Venezuela piece and the Iran piece is doing kind of what that first Gulf War piece did to Russia and China. It's scaring the living daylights out of them because it's showing how very good we are as a military. I mean, we are so far ahead of anybody else that's out there in our ability to plan, conduct, command and control, the weapons we have are very, very impressive. So I think that Xi Jinping is probably looking at this going, yeah, okay, maybe they're running a little bit low on weapons, but these guys are pretty good. And I'm not so sure about my own guys because I saw what happened to Vladimir Putin's guys in Ukraine. So maybe not today. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But we have got to fund these weapons, and we've got to help. We don't need to be yelling at the prime contractors. We need to be helping them get this production ramped up.
I think that your last point there is one that, I don't know, it's something that I didn't really anticipate, thinking coming out of this conflict. Because if you've ever done any kind of large scale planning, the fact that we've hit thousands of targets in Iran over the course of, like, the amount of just even airspace planning that had to go into for this, let alone the fact that our weapon systems and our capability to penetrate through whatever was left of the Iranian air defenses is incredible. And a lot of the systems that Iran employs are Russian and Chinese made systems. And so to see how well American technology is performing against those systems is very, very encouraging, particularly as an active duty service member. But I think to your point, as we use these high-end systems, we're going to need to continue to work with the primes to get this, this stockpile established, because there is going to be a period where when we run out of these things, it's not like we can develop a Tomahawk missile, build a Tomahawk missile like that. It's not like you can, like a dumb bomb. A lot of these components are very sophisticated, and they provide a significant deterrent. And the deterrent that we just talked about how good we are performing against a country like Iran, Russia and China probably have a little bit more sophisticated and well-developed militaries. But all of that does not matter. You can have any amount of force structure that you want, but if you do not have the munitions that would come off of that force structure to actually provide that deterrent, then you do not have a deterrent.
Exactly. One of the things that has to be going through Putin's and Xi Jinping's mind is, this is 2 times in a row that we've actually gone after a leader, one time kidnapping him, one time killing him. And, how did they do that? And I'm a little worried about my own self here.
But I think that there's a major difference, and you've talked about this, and it's part of the reason why Iran and the supreme leader wanted to pursue getting a nuclear weapon is because the reason why we have not gone after Xi or Putin, as you well know, Dad, is because they have a nuclear weapon. They have that caveat, and no American president is going to get the United States in a nuclear war by going after someone else's leader, a leader that has a nuclear weapon. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was, China gets a lot of its energy from Iran. And with the Strait of Hormuz closed, or, at least pseudo-closed or threatened to be closed, a lot of traffic is no longer transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I know China has, I've read reporting that they have about 100-day buildup of oil, fuel that they were in, because they were anticipating something like this might happen as a strategic buffer. But if that starts to, if they start to whittle away at their strategic oil reserves, and now Iran is no longer an option, what does that look like strategically? Is it a strategic win for the United States? What does that kind of look like? Because I think that there's a significant link between Iran and China that may not be relatively apparent to the general observer.
So first of all, China is in fact meaningfully dependent on oil coming from the Middle East, but it only gets about 12 to 15% of its oil from Iran. So it gets 50% of its oil from the Middle East. When you think about it, 100 days, you wouldn't want to push up against that if you're China, but that's a pretty decent supply considering how long this war is likely to last. I would be very, very surprised if we're still duking it out with Iran in even 2 months, much less 3. So there's some slop there. The initial impact in China is going to be on prices. Their price of oil is going to go up probably more in China than it is, in the U.S. because we're largely self-sufficient here. But there's enough time in there where China will be able to adjust its supply sources if necessary, more from Russia. And the other thing to consider is the U.S. has said today, the president said today, that we're going to escort oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's not for China. It's not for Iran. It's for our partners in the Middle East who export oil, and they're exporting oil to China. So China may actually be owing us a doozy here if we can reopen that big pipeline coming out of the Middle East headed for China. But it does highlight a vulnerability that China has when you talk about impacting their economy if they do something against Taiwan that is malign. Some people go, yeah, but they've got a 100-day supply. And I go, yeah, it's only a 100-day supply. That's meaningful if they choose to do something we don't want them to do. It's only underscored their dependency there. But I think they're going to be okay. I don't think anybody's going to be panicking in China right now, but in a couple of months they could be.
Yeah, and it's not just the Strait of Hormuz. You have the Strait of Malacca as well, where a lot of that oil flows from the Middle East, out of the Middle East, through the Strait of Malacca and Indonesia up to China. But do you think that the United States is only going to escort oil that's bound towards some of our allies? Or is it, hey, we want to make sure that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are happy, so even if it's a Chinese flagged vessel or a ship headed towards China, that we would put American service members' lives on the line to defend that kind of an oil tanker?
I don't think it matters. You have to view oil as a commodity. And it is, it's out there, it's going wherever it goes. And again, if Qatar, Saudi Arabia is exporting oil, we want to keep them on side. We want to keep the price of oil low for the American people. It's certainly very much in President Trump's interest to keep that price down. And it doesn't matter whether that's oil going to China or elsewhere. It's really a commoditized piece, and that's the way you should think about it.
In your opinion, do you think that Beijing would like to see a similar style regime to what was just basically decapitated in Iran? Or do you think that they would be more amenable to maybe not a democracy, but one that's more closely aligned, maybe not necessarily with the United States, but maybe with some of the other Gulf, nations?
I think there's a term that Vladimir Putin has used in the past called useful idiots. And I think that's how China is looking at Iran. They don't have any ideological solidarity with the Iranian regime. They just wanted a regime that was friendly to them. And remember, China doesn't have an awful lot of friends in the world. That was friendly to them and that they could rely on, say, for cheap oil. Because with the sanctions that Iran is under, I would imagine China's getting that oil at a much better price than they would from other places. So that's what they care about. It's all about the Chinese national self-interest. And they make a point that we don't really care what happens to a government in Africa, let's say. We don't care if they're democratic or if they're authoritarian, as long as they give us the natural resources that we're looking for. So it's a very Machiavellian kind of thing.
I want to pivot to Europe because I think there's an equal play here. And I think there's two kind of things that are at play with Iran with respect to Europe. Since the Russia-Ukraine war, Europe's gotten a lot of its LNG from a lot more of it, at least from the Middle East than it did, because a lot of it originally came from Russia, and now obviously that's been semi-cut off. And we just talked about the effect that it would have on China if the Strait of Hormuz was closed. I think there's a similar effect there potentially with Europe and some of our allies and partners there. And then the second piece is with the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia was getting a significant amount of Shahed drones from Iran, and I think some other military technology, some other assistance. Obviously, I think that would now be cut off. Not necessarily because the Ayatollah was removed from power, but because now they're having to contend with the United States and a bunch of other Gulf states attacking them. What is your thought process on the connection between what's happening in Iran and Europe?
So let's take the second one first. Russia is actually now building Shahed drones. They're no longer importing them from Iran. So they took the design. Iran willingly let them do it, obviously in exchange for something else. We know not what. Could have been nuclear technology or some other thing. But Russia is actually building those things themselves. So that's not too much of a factor. On the LNG side, it turns out that Europe gets about maybe right now from Qatar, for example, it gets 10 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar, and Qatar's probably the largest exporter there. So it's meaningful, but it's not dominant in terms of an effect on Europe. In Europe, it's more of a country by country thing. It turns out that Italy, France, and Belgium probably are more dependent on Middle Eastern natural gas than the rest of Europe is. And Europe gets about 50% of its LNG from the United States now. So it is something to be mindful of. just as with China, it's going to affect pricing. Pricing has already gone way up in Europe for liquid natural gas, just because that's the way things work. But I still think that there will be room for maneuver there, especially, again, if the U.S. starts successfully escorting LNG tankers, oil tankers, out of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, keep in mind, it's interesting the sequence of strikes that we saw here. The first strikes that were there on Saturday were primarily against the leadership, because that was kind of goal number one, and also against the things that opened the door for you to be able to do strikes. So going against the Iranian air defense systems. And also, shortly after that, Iranian ballistic missile systems, because you don't want them to be able to retaliate against Israel and regional countries. That's an ongoing battle. But one of the things that came shortly on the heels of that is you heard a lot of strikes going around the Bushehr area in Iran. And Bushehr is at the top of that loop of the Strait of Hormuz. It's where there's an awful lot of Iranian naval bases and the like. And you heard the president say the other day that every single Iranian warship is now, he said, floating at the bottom of the ocean.
Floating at the bottom of the ocean.
I don't know what that means, but they're sunk. But there are two other really important things that we have probably been hitting there. One of those is their mine storage facilities, and of course the ships that could be laying those mines. We probably did that as quickly as we could. And then there are a number of sites along the Iranian coast of the Strait of Hormuz that have surface anti-ship cruise missiles. And they're in caves, that sort of thing, but we've probably been doing a pretty big number on the entrances to those firing sites. And then, of course, if we escort the oil tankers and theoretically can protect them. Now, would you want to be the first oil tanker being escorted out of the Strait of Hormuz? Was your insurance company going to want you to be and you notice that when we said we were going to escort those tankers, we also said we were going to provide insurance for those tankers. So it'll be interesting in the coming days to see how that plays out. It may not happen immediately. There may be more work that needs to be done to sort of isolate the Strait of Hormuz and keep it open. But I think it's actually a pretty good move on the administration's part to calm the markets a little bit by saying that we would escort those ships.
If you look at the Dow today, at the beginning of the day, it dropped almost 1,000 points. And then immediately after that announcement, the Dow shot right back up. And I think it ended the day down still. And it's shed about 1,000 points. Yeah, it's shed about 1,000 points. But over the last 3 days, it's shed about 1,000 points. But yeah, down about 3 to 4 to 500 points. The next thing, and really the last thing that I want to jump to is maybe some of the more squishy part of this, some of the squishy third and fourth order effects with respect to, the rules-based order, which I think is almost effectively dead at this point, and also talking a little bit about the fact that these strikes were conducted without the approval from Congress. So, talking about doing this unilaterally, almost unilaterally, the only other country we did it with was Israel, and doing it without approval from Congress. I know you have some thoughts on this, and I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so remember when I talked about if you have high correlation with national interest, you'd be more willing to use military force. And with extremely high correlation, you would be more willing to do it unilaterally, to do it at cost of blood, cost of treasure, opportunity cost, and pushing against international law. Well, we've covered 4 of the 5 of those things. Fortunately, we have not lost that many people. I think it's currently sitting at 6, and we hope no more get lost. And of course, we extend our heartfelt best wishes to the wonderful families whose loved ones have given the ultimate sacrifice. But in terms of opportunity cost, the weapons we talked about earlier, that's opportunity cost. In terms of treasure, this is a very expensive operation. In terms of pushing against international law, well, that flew out the window on Saturday morning. This is so far against international law. And it's interesting because the president is talking about war, and a number of his other people are talking about self-defense and trying to walk that back a little bit. But there's no question that it's not helping the sort of confusing answers from inside the administration. And Congress has got to decide whether it's going to step up and reclaim its ownership of the use of force, or whether it's going to be a weak Congress and let this be set as a precedent for future presidents to use force pretty much whenever they want. And as I've said before, I always believe that the rule of power is always best when it's backed by the rule of law. rather than not by the rule of law. And in this case, both domestic and international law are questionable. We need to figure this out and decide how we're going to restrain presidents from using force.
I think it was very telling because we've assembled the greatest alliance in the history of the world through NATO, and it has led to, as we've mentioned several times on this podcast, 80 years essentially of some of the most unparalleled peace that this world has ever seen. Yes, there have been regional conflicts, but there's not been another world war. And the fact that a lot of our closest allies, to include the UK, were not behind us, were not supporting, and very loudly saying so prior to the strikes. The United Kingdom was not going to let us use Diego Garcia, like they have in the past. But the fact that we have done this relatively unilaterally with only one other country that definitely had it at their own self-interest when in Israel to conduct these strikes, it has been asking for this for a long time, I think was incredibly telling. And I think the other piece too, the precedent that this sets for future presidents, because if Congress does not step up and at least have an inquiry and have a vote about whether or not this should be continued to be authorized, this kind of military action, then it means that any president down the line can do something similar by claiming, self-defense or declaiming an imminent threat.
Yeah, and again, as we've mentioned before on the podcast, there are really three ways you're allowed under international law to use force. And one is if you have UN Security Council resolution, which we didn't in this case. Another is defense against an imminent attack, and we've covered that already today. And then the other is if a country invites you onto their soil to help them out with some insurgency or something like that. None of those have been addressed. And what we found is our allies have almost always been very, very supportive of this when we've asked them to help with something we were doing. But it's always been under circumstances that were under international law or under a legitimacy construct such as in Kosovo and in Syria when a leader was murdering his own people. So it is interesting that and in fact, within the EU, Spain is quite vocal in pushing against this, and the administration announced today that they're going to cut off all trade with Spain. We'll see whether that happens or not. But and frankly, if international law regarding the use of force is basically blown to smithereens, then that is yet another signal of a geopolitical cycle ending trajectory, because you can't really have an orderly world unless you have some sort of rule of law.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad we were able to touch on some of the third and fourth order effects, maybe giving you, the listener, a different perspective than just here's where we're striking, here's what's happening with oil prices, here's what's happening on the ground. Seen a lot of growth in our Substack in the last week. So please, if you enjoy this, if you think you get something out of it and that somebody would get something out of it, please share it with your network and your friends and family. But we'll see you next Tuesday with another podcast episode, and stay tuned for some more written content coming out this week. Thank you, everybody.
Be careful out there, everybody.